So, I finally earned tenure. Now what? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jonathan. I'm a wildlife ecology professor helping you to build the wild kitchen. So this week's video is a little bit different. I don't talk about my day job much, but today I think I should, because I've reached a milestone that I've been working towards for over a decade. And that milestone is tenure. Now, if you are not familiar with the concept of tenure, or you've heard about it and you're not quite sure what it means, don't worry, I'm going to cover that in this video. But I also wanted to talk about my personal journey in this process, spill a little tea on why this process for me took so long, and then talk about what earning tenure means for this channel and for my business. All right, let's get going. Okay, let's first talk about what tenure is. And essentially, for anyone who is working as a professor in higher education, tenure is the holy grail. Earning tenure means that you cannot be fired from your position as a professor in an institution simply because somebody doesn't like you or like what you are studying or teaching. And that protection is really important because sometimes we need to pursue knowledge and teach about topics that make certain folks in power uncomfortable, but nonetheless need to be understood, and that information needs to be disseminated amongst people in the population. Now, there are lots of examples of these topics, anything from the topic of race and gender to important biomedical research that might have some financial implications for certain corporations who might be invested in that illness or that ailment remaining in the population. And because people with power can influence the things that get done in society, tenure is supposed to provide a space for people to pursue knowledge for knowledge's sake and for the benefit of the society, regardless of how somebody who has lots of money or lots of power might feel about it. And so once a professor has earned tenure, in order to remove them from their position, there has to be good reason. Now, earning tenure doesn't mean that you are never able to be fired from your position, and certainly if you violate the faculty code of conduct or you're engaged in criminal activity, you essentially void the protections of tenure. But aside from that, studying or teaching about something that's controversial is not a grounds to be removed from your job. But because tenure is such a benefit to the person who earns it, there are some pretty strict requirements for earning this privilege. Now, those requirements vary depending on what institution a professor is hired at, but regardless of what institution you're hired at, a new assistant professor on the tenure track has roughly 5 years to conduct high-quality research, teaching, and service in order to earn tenure. Now, at the end of that time period, each professor organizes all the things that they've accomplished, all the documentation of these accomplishments, and typically writes a narrative for each area of work that they're going to be judged on their tenure case. And that tenure file is submitted and reviewed at multiple levels at the university. Now, the wild thing about tenure that I think a lot of people don't know, and oftentimes when I ask my students about their knowledge of this process, they're shocked to learn this detail. Hey folks, I just wanted to take a break and let you know that one of the best ways to get the most out of the content on this channel is to subscribe to my newsletter. Every Sunday, I give you more depth and insight into the topics I cover on Out There JCH, including thoughts and perspectives that I don't really share on this platform. The newsletter is free to sign up, and as an incentive to becoming a subscriber, I'm offering a free wild food resource guide that will help make you a more capable harvester and home cook. Just click the link in the description to sign up. Okay, let's get back to the episode. That if you earn tenure, great, you get to stay at that institution for life. But if after that 5-year period, you have not done enough to earn that tenure, then you essentially have 1 year or 2 semesters to find another job, and then you're kicked out of the university. So the stakes couldn't be higher in any given tenure process. And if you've ever been around a new professor leading up to the submission of their tenure file, you might notice that they might be a little bit nervous or stressed. So earning tenure is a big deal, and it's important to understand what goes into that and to know that earning tenure doesn't give a professor carte blanche to do whatever they want, but at the same time, and on the other side of the coin, it doesn't allow them to be removed from their important job of education and generating knowledge simply by the whims of somebody who is on the outside and doesn't like who they are or what they're studying. So let's talk about my tenure journey. So my tenure process looked different, and it took more than twice as long as it typically does for assistant professors. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I started my academic career at West Virginia University. Now, if you know anything about West Virginia University, over the last couple of years, they've run into a lot of financial trouble, and there's been, let's say, a reduction in personnel of epic proportions because of lack of funding is the nicest way that I can put it. Fortunately, I'm no longer working at that institution, and in fact left before the shit hit the fan. But while I was there, my time to earn tenure, which is typically referred to as the tenure clock, was delayed several times for legitimate reasons. The first two reasons were the birth of my two kids. And this is a policy that a lot of institutions have adopted because they recognize that when you are a new parent, you don't really have a lot of time to devote to the duties of your job. And so at WVU, like at other institutions, the birth of the child allows you to delay your tenure clock by 1 year. And so I took those two opportunities to give myself time to be the best father that I could, to be the best partner that I could, and to just generally support the house in welcoming a new human to it. And then my tenure clock was delayed a third time because in 2020 there was like something that happened. I don't know if you all remember what that was, but anyway, I've forgotten what it was. But anyway, it was delayed because of that, whatever was going on. And so those were legitimate reasons to delay my tenure clock because there was just stuff going on that didn't allow me or anybody in that position to give full focus and be their best at their job. So I'm thankful for those opportunities and those policies because I think it was the right thing to do. But then I had to leave WVU. And the reason why I left was essentially because my working environment had become incredibly toxic. It became increasingly toxic the more vocal I became about some of the things that I was seeing that were wrong with the way that we functioned as a department, as a college, and an institution. And as typically is the case, when you start speaking truth to power, those in power or who have more power than you don't really like that and do all sorts of things to undermine your ability to hold folks accountable. And so over the course of about 4 years, I became increasingly aware that that department and that institution was not a place that I could continue my career. So right before the pandemic hit, I began to look for other opportunities at different institutions and fortunately found one here in Michigan. And what was a wake-up call for me was my physical health began to really suffer. Because of dealing with the toxicity of the environment, I started to get stomach pains, I wasn't sleeping, I was becoming more difficult to deal with and more grumpy and short with my family members and just really was suffering. I remember a specific time when I was having a conversation with a senior colleague about something that they did that I thought was unfair and inappropriate. And I had copied this email to another senior colleague to just sort of like check in and say, like, am I crazy? Am I wrong for trying to hold this person accountable for something that I think they did? And as I was waiting for a reply from the other senior colleague, who at the time was an ally, my stomach just really started to hurt, like debilitating stomach pain. And when that senior colleague ally answered, and I read the email and they said, nope, you're not crazy. You're absolutely right for doing that. My stomach pain immediately went away. And that was an incredible cue for me to be like, oh, like the mental stress that you're experiencing in this job and dealing with some of your colleagues is actually manifesting itself physically. And I never went to the doctor to see whether or not I was having ulcers or these sorts of things. But I do know that I haven't had anything like that stomach pain or other physical symptoms that were so acute since leaving that institution. So I'm much happier in Michigan. It's a much better situation for me in that my situation now is not toxic, but also I'm at an institution that better matches the type of academic that I want to be. which is a little less focus on research and more on teaching and mentorship. So that's really been great. The negative aspect of the fact of having to switch institutions and to, in the process, delay my tenure clock by a couple of years to make the adjustment to the way that faculty do things here versus how they did things at WVU means I have been essentially stuck at the assistant professor level salary for twice as long as many of my counterparts. Now, I'm going to enjoy that pay bump, but because I've spent more time as an assistant professor, which means that I have less time spending it as an associate professor and then, after the next promotion, full professor. So I've missed out on being able to earn an associate professor salary. One of my dear friends who finished just 2 years before I did, or maybe it was a year before I did, has been a full professor for a full 4 years before I got promoted to associate professor. So missing out on that income is something that is kind of a sore spot, and I think will always be a sore spot, which is in part why I started this channel. So let's talk about what's next now that I've earned tenure. So the job security that comes with earning tenure can be used in a lot of different ways. And unfortunately, as those of you who've gone to college, you might have run across this. But sometimes when professors earn tenure, they kind of mail it in. They're like, well, you can't fire me for being a mediocre professor, or mediocre teacher, or a mediocre researcher, so why would I work that hard? And that's one of the drawbacks of tenure. But I think more often than not, professors, when they get promoted, use that job security to challenge themselves and challenge institutions to do better, to push the envelope. And that's something I absolutely plan to do as an academic, but having the job security also is going to allow me to push the envelope in other areas. Now, I've talked about what starting this channel has meant to me in a previous video on this channel, and I've certainly delved into some controversial topics around wild food on this channel. But now that I have tenure, I'm really looking forward to having the security to push that envelope. I mentioned earlier that I haven't been as productive on this platform in terms of generating content as I would have liked, and a large part of that was due to the fact that my day job was taking up a lot of my time. Putting together a tenure file takes a long time and a lot of effort. My tenure file that I submitted ended up being nearly 1,000 pages. I spent most of last summer and the early part of fall doing, which was time that I couldn't devote to generating content on this channel. Now, there's other topics that I plan to talk about moving forward that I haven't really talked about in great detail on this channel that I think would be interesting to a general audience, because I was worried about how that would be perceived by people who are evaluating my tenure case. When you submit your tenure file for review, it gets reviewed by colleagues in your department chair, then typically the dean of the college that your department is in, then the provost, who is the lead personnel administrator at every institution, then the university president, and then ultimately the board of governors or the board of regents grants you tenure at the end of the academic year. I submitted my tenure file in October of 2024, and just yesterday, June 26, 2025, I got word that I had been promoted to associate professor with tenure. So it's a long process, and a lot of that time after you've submitted your file is just sort of worrying about whether or not you're going to be approved at each level of evaluation. So I say all that to say that the stress and the process of going through the tenure process just this past year has limited my ability to create content on this channel, both in terms of volume and in some cases the topics that I want to talk about. But that's no longer the case. And so moving forward on this platform, I'm very much looking forward to bringing you more content more frequently and topics that go a little bit deeper and into some even more uncomfortable realms potentially that I think is certainly led to personal growth, and I hope is going to lead to generative conversations and good relations for those who tune in. So moving forward, you can expect more from me. Not gonna lie, it feels so good to be through this process, to have worked hard and for so long, and to have reached this milestone. I couldn't be happier and couldn't be more thankful to all of the people that helped me get to this point. My personal tenure process took longer than it should have, but that's okay, because in that time, I've learned a lot about myself and had the time and space to really develop how I want to show up in this space and create community around the topic of wild food and the outdoors. So I plan to put my increased time and security to good use moving forward. If you're curious about what it's like being a college professor or had any questions about the higher education process, drop a comment below. I'm really curious if this is something that you all want to hear about, as I mentioned it in my intro for each one of these videos. But just sort of in general, it's been my experience that people don't really understand what academics do. And I'd love to, if there's interest, I'd love to bring more of that to this channel. If this video has created an appetite for some controversial topics, then you might want to check out this video. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Got Tenure. Y'all can suck it.